Everyone sees Bruno Mars as the performer, the confidence, the control, the kind of presence that makes everything look effortless, the timing, the voice, the way every movement feels intentional, and at first glance, it all makes sense: years of success, consistent performances, songs that don't just release but stay everywhere, for months, sometimes years, and when you look at it from the outside, it feels complete, like everything adds up exactly the way it should. But when you sit with it a little longer, when you stop just watching and start noticing, something doesn't fully explain itself, not in a dramatic way, not something obvious you can point to, just a quiet feeling that there's more behind it than what we're seeing, because people don't reach that level and stay there without something driving them underneath, something steady, something constant, and sometimes, that kind of drive doesn't come from ambition. It comes from somewhere much earlier, somewhere that doesn't go away, even when everything else changes. And the strange part is, even with everything he's achieved, even with the consistency, the control, the success that most people spend their entire lives chasing, there have been moments where it didn't seem like enough, not publicly, not in a way that turns into headlines, but in the way everything continues without pause, the way nothing slows down, the way everything feels like it has to stay at a certain level, all the time. Like it can't drop, like it can't break, like it can't even hesitate, and that's where the story starts to feel different, because this isn't just about reaching success anymore, it's about maintaining it, holding it in place, and maintaining something at that level takes a different kind of energy, a different kind of mindset, something that doesn't turn off when the performance ends. So the real question isn't how he became successful, because that part is visible, it's documented, it's clear. The real question is what he had to become to stay there, what kind of version of himself had to form to handle that level of consistency, that level of expectation, because people don't just rise to that point, they adapt to it, and sometimes, that adaptation changes more than just what they do, it changes how they operate completely. Because this didn't start with fame, it didn't start with big stages, recognition, or global attention, it started in a completely different environment, one where performing wasn't something you chose, it was something you lived inside, something that existed around you constantly, and when something becomes normal that early, it doesn't feel like effort, it feels like identity, it becomes part of how you understand yourself, without even realizing it. At just 4 years old, he was already on stage, not occasionally, not as a one-time moment, but consistently, regularly, performing in front of real audiences, learning timing, reactions, energy, taking on roles, copying legends like Elvis Presley with a level of detail that didn't feel forced, it felt natural, like something he didn't have to think about, and people noticed immediately, not just because it was impressive, but because it felt real, like he wasn't trying to become something, he already was it. And when that kind of reaction happens early, it doesn't just build confidence, it builds direction. And when direction forms that early, it becomes harder to separate from it later, because you don't grow into who you are independently, you grow into what works, what people respond to, what gets reinforced over and over again, and that reinforcement builds something powerful, but also something limiting, because it ties your identity to something external. That wasn't normal? Because when your sense of self is shaped through reactions, through applause, through performance, it doesn't fully belong to you anymore, it becomes shared, influenced, adjusted over time, and at that age, there's no reason to question it, because it works, because it feels right, because it's all you've known. But everything changed, and it didn't shift slowly, it didn't give time to adjust, it broke, his parents separated, the structure that had been constant disappeared, and suddenly, everything that had felt stable before, didn't exist in the same way anymore, and when that happens early, it doesn't just change circumstances, it changes perception. There were nights where stability didn't exist, nights where sleep depended on wherever space could be found, a car, rooftops, temporary places that were never meant to be permanent, and this is where the story shifts completely, because performing stops being expression, and starts becoming survival. And survival creates a different kind of pattern. Because when something becomes your way out, your way forward, your way to maintain any sense of control, it doesn't stay optional, it becomes necessary. And when something becomes necessary at that level, it stays, even when things get better, and if you're starting to see how that builds, how something that looks like talent is actually rooted in something deeper, something more constant, then you're already watching this differently than most people, And that's exactly why subscribing matters here, because this isn't just about success, it's about understanding what creates it, and what continues to shape it long after it becomes visible. Because eventually, things did change, opportunities started appearing, slowly at first, small openings, small chances, and then gradually, they grew, more consistent, more noticeable, and then everything accelerated, songs started landing, people started paying attention, and suddenly, the same person who had been trying to hold everything together was now impossible to ignore. But here's where it becomes more complex. Because success doesn't erase what came before it, it builds on top of it. Layer by layer, and when the foundation is built on pressure, on survival, on constant performance, the structure that grows from it carries that same pattern forward, just in a more refined form.
From the outside, everything looked exactly how success is supposed to look. Hit songs, global reach, performances that felt sharp, controlled, almost perfect. And when you watch it from a distance, it feels effortless, but effort doesn't disappear. It just becomes invisible. And when something grows that fast, there isn't time to step back and separate from it. There isn't space to process it. And when there's no separation, everything starts to merge. That's where things shift, because when someone spends years performing, adapting, responding to expectations, adjusting constantly, it becomes harder to recognize where the performance ends and the person begins. At the same time, there were parts of his life that existed outside of that system, quieter moments, relationships that weren't built around performance, attempts at something stable, something grounded, something that didn't require constant output. His relationship with Jessica felt like that kind of space. Something consistent, something private, something separate from everything else. And maybe that's why it worked. Because when everything around you is intense, you look for something that isn't, something that doesn't demand the same level of control, but even that didn't stay untouched. Because when everything else keeps moving, when the pace never really slows down, stability starts to feel different. Small changes begin to appear, not dramatic, not immediate, just subtle shifts, moments that don't stand out on their own, but when they repeat, they start to form something, patterns, and patterns don't form randomly, they build from repetition. And this is where the question comes back again, what is actually driving all of this? Because by this point, it's not just about achieving something, it's about maintaining it constantly, without interruption, and that kind of pressure doesn't disappear, it evolves, it adapts. It becomes part of how everything functions. Then came the moment that shifted everything again, not confirmed clearly, not fully explained, but strong enough to change perception. The gambling rumors, numbers that sounded extreme, stories that spread quickly, narratives that didn't fully match the image people had built. And suddenly, something felt different. And this is where things become more complex. Because perception doesn't need full confirmation to exist. Once it starts, it builds on its own. People begin connecting things, interpreting things, trying to understand something that doesn't fully explain itself. And what made it more interesting wasn't just the rumor, it was the response, or the lack of it. Because instead of reacting strongly, instead of addressing it directly, it was handled differently, more controlled, more contained, almost like it wasn't something that needed to be explained publicly. And that changes how everything feels. Because when someone doesn't react the way you expect, it creates more questions than answers. At the same time, nothing stopped. The performances continued. The success remained consistent. Everything on the surface stayed exactly the same, but that's what makes this different, because sometimes the most controlled version of something is also the most protected version. And that brings the question back again, what is he actually carrying behind all of this? Because when you look at everything together, the early pressure, the constant performance, the rise that never slowed down, the personal shifts, the public speculation, it doesn't feel like separate moments. It feels like one continuous pattern, and patterns don't exist without a reason. Maybe it's the need to keep moving. Maybe it's the habit of performing even when there's no stage. Maybe it's something deeper that started long before anyone was watching. And maybe that's why even now, there's still a part of his story that feels just out of reach. Not missing, just not fully seen. Because the truth is, this was never just about success, it was about what he had to become to sustain it. And if you followed this all the way through, then you're not just watching a story, you're recognizing a pattern, something most people don't stop to think about. And if that's the kind of perspective you want more of, then subscribing isn't just about staying updated, it's about continuing to see what most people overlook. Because there's always more happening beneath the surface than what you see at first.